What it is, what it was, what it shall be, video 66. Today we're talking about thought forms in popular culture. So we're going to get back to our Kabbalah. There's a key term in Kabbalah called the qlippoth. And the qlippoth values 660, right? So today's video 66. So we got to talk about these guys. Qlippoth. I mean, it's kind of a hazy concept. You really have to go deep to understand it. But let's just say, imagine the construct of reality is almost like a computer language, right? There's these codes and patterns, right? For example, you could say like the code of how dogs walk around and smell the ground, you know? It's like a subroutine, it's a program. Like as soon as they're born, they probably know how to do that. Or like licking stuff. You know, it probably doesn't take them too long because the code for licking stuff or like smelling the ground is like so deep in their DNA that it happens almost by itself. Like they wouldn't even necessarily have to think a conscious thought like maybe I should lick stuff. Like they just do it. So, or you could think of like the wind, you know, there's always wind somewhere. It's always just blowing around. It's like this little program that runs, right? So these qlippoth are kind of like code fragments, right? So let's say some future alien archaeologist comes to Earth and finds all these hard drives and all these like memory storage components and like is looking through there and finds like a super old program like MS-DOS 4.0 or some shit like that, like this really old program code, right? But that code could be like cannibalized or like broken apart, and they could take a piece of code here and there and like cobble together some like Frankenstein code, right? And make it just run like a program. And there's a weird thing with computing that I've heard people talking about quite a bit, is how oftentimes that's how programming works, is like you take this old clunky ass code from way forever, and since it would take so long to rewrite the entire thing, you just include the whole thing and like put a layer on top. So there's this weird way that code just accretes and gets clunkier and clunkier and more terrible as you go. But the point is to say, okay, or DNA, think of our DNA, like the DNA for eyebrow hair or something like that. I like thick eyebrows, I'm just saying. Anyways, you know, these kinds of codes are floating around out there. So what if not just our biology and our bodies, but like reality itself is a sea of all these codes, right? So somewhere at some previous time, we're all speaking hypothetically. This is just a paradigm to consider things, right? So say somewhere our simulation or this reality or whatever you want to call it was created, right? So the creation of that was like, oh, let's make some fish in the sea. Let's make some birds, you know, and these are almost like codes, right? So now then let's flip over to how thought forms appear in pop culture. That's the second piece of the ingredient. Like, remember that movie Ghostbusters, where at the very end, you know, the Zool or whatever, it says like, choose what form your destruction will come in, right? So somewhere within Dan Aykroyd's mind is the concept of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. And so for one instant, he thinks of that thought form, and then boom, it manifests into reality. And it has all the qualities of the marshmallows, like it's all sticky and gooey and stuff like that, and it's all soft and smushy, right? So that thought form was animated by Zool with the energy of his mind to take form in the world and cause outer change. Okay, so that's one example. You know, there's other modern examples of like the Slender Man and stuff. Like they had this contest to create the scariest horror character possible. And somebody came across this image and concept of the Slender Man. And so like once that happened, people everywhere started seeing Slender Man everywhere. You know what I mean? Even though he wasn't, quote, real. It was a thought form that got animated, and enough energy went into it that it built this like momentum, right? And started taking on life of its own. So then think about any of these Halloween costumes that we have, like the zombie or the vampire or something somewhere. Like say someone's in a dream state or whatever, they're in a state of variable conscious like permeability where they can be imprinted more easily. They don't have their senses like distracting them because they're in a state of sleep, right? And so their senses are shut off. And so now they can perceive all this more subtle shit. So like these thought forms can get in there, and you could have a scary dream of a vampire or wolf man or shit that theoretically doesn't even exist, right? But due to the fact of you recognizing it and feeding it with emotional energy and focus, like if you see something that scares you, you like zoom in on it because you want to find out how to react. So it grabs your attention. Or similarly, something sexy and beautiful that you desire, like either way, it grabs your attention, right? So let's say, theoretically, again, we're building this paradigm and we're saying like, there's a realm of energy beings, right? And either their energy is such that it's not visible to our senses, or perhaps they exist in a completely external dimension to what we consider reality, right? So the only way they can interact with our dimension and cause change and influence events to their liking is by appearing to people's minds. So say a thought form like Jesus or a vampire or a fucking wolfman, you know, that could be very useful. Or a sexy woman, you know, like the lady in the red dress from the Matrix. You know, these are all tools that could be really useful for capturing human attention and manipulating human actions, right? So now you're starting to understand how thought forms work. But think about a thought form like Mickey Mouse or like, you know, Jesus or something. You know, it's this idea and this image that got painted somewhere, you know, some way back when, and now it's just propagating and people replicate it. Like people will just sit doodling and they'll doodle someone else's ideas, and in a way they're giving attention, focus, energy to these things, and they're animating their, you know, in their imagination they could imagine all these different stories that G.I. Joe or Barbie or like whatever will do. But this is like an empty husk, right? It's a qlippoth. It's like a shell. It's a piece of code that was created by someone that can be recognized by anyone else with similar sensory apparatus. Like they could see that face and be like, oh, that's Barbie, or oh, that's Michael Jackson, or oh, blah, 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 the Statue of Liberty, right? Memes. It's kind of like the old school version of memes. Right? It's informational content that has a shared recognition and evokes a particular set of emotional responses. Bam. Okay, so now we got the qlippoth, right? So now this goes all the way back, so deep, like all this Goetia and all these ancient gods, like Babylonian gods, and like, you know, angels and demons. I was gonna say amens and angels, but you get the idea. Anyways, this is part of our psychic architecture in our genetic memory. Many believe that to be the case. So this is an example of how thought forms work in our world. And okay, so another example is the internal concepts of these, right? So internally, maybe once when we were a little tiny kid, we got bit by a dog, or like we had some normally everyday experience that in that one instance like turned sour and traumatized us, right? So somewhere people have a fear of dogs, or they have a fear of heights, or they have a fear of water, or they have a fear of phobias, right? They could have, and they're irrational phobias. Like that thing that they're afraid of isn't really a threat to them in reality, right? But they're carrying around this piece of code and this thought form based on some way past like experience, right? And you can see this with, you know, abuse victims and even animals, right, that have been mistreated. Like those echoes and those thought forms from like past trauma is still influencing their behavior. And unfortunately, it's like creating a inappropriate response and a hazy, inaccurate perception of reality because of this thought form like echoing around inside of them. Okay? So most of the Buddhist path really, and the wizarding path similarly, is to have incredible mastery in both creating, manipulating, and defending against these pernicious thought forms, right? Because what is wizarding? I mean, it's basically the use of power and energy to create change, right? The more power and energy you generate and multiply and magnify, like you can become a magnet for these parasitic beings and energies, or parasitic thought forms, right? Because just like these imaginary beings in the outer world or in our imaginations can like grab onto and animate energy, right? We have our own thought forms within. Everyone knows what it's like to have a thought loop. Like there's just something you're obsessing on and you just keep going around and around, and like you can't stop thinking about it. So it's almost like that vortex of spinning energy, your thought loops, is like sucking in all this real physical energy, like the food you eat and all the energy that's flowing through your body. Like that little vortex is like sucking it all up, right? To sustain its existence. And that's like obsessive thought patterns. And everyone gets in that. And there's a lot of different disabilities, like some of the autism spectrum and these different people, like perseveration is a key part of their pathology. Like they'll just repeat something over and over and over because they know it's not right, but they don't know how to fix it. So they just loop around back and back and back. And sometimes they'll get really violent or angry and they just loop around like that. So what I'm trying to get at is, like, as you get into wizarding, as you try to wield this sacred divine power that we all have as human beings, you're building your energy mentally and physically, and you're building your perceptions. So your perceptions become more accurate and more precise and more focused. But there's a certain type of, like, in the initial phases, that intensity is imbalancing, perhaps, maybe. You're not prepared to deal with that level of intensity, right? But the first step to building that ability is the recognition of all these different energy forms and thought forms that we can have, and to be transparent to ourselves so we can see what's operating, right, in our mind, in our consciousness, and like how we're making decisions and what methods we're trying to use to produce the results we want, right? So if we can detect the deceptive presence of these thought forms, or more importantly, if we can create positive thought forms, this really is the key to changing ourselves. And as I said in a previous video, there's no upper limit, you know, there really is not. So you can keep building. Like, to be a great artist or a musician or an athlete or a great thinker or mathematician, like, that's nothing. That's just kind of an initial introduction into this level of mastery that can be obtained, right? And there's no top. There's no precedent for what you personally, as an individual, there's no precedent for what you're capable to achieve. And what I'm trying to do is help you find and discover these ancient tools that we have. And it goes all across cultures, right? So speaking of thought forms and these qlippoth, right? In ancient Egypt, they had this thing they called the river of the duat. And that's the barrier between the place where we depart our life and depart our body at death, and then to get to this, like, promised land of the pure paradise, you have to cross this duat, which is like the river of I think it's like qlippoth. I think it's really similar to that. It's like, sometimes they say it's stuff like the souls of all those who died insane or something. It's all these psychological fragments, you know? It's almost like a poltergeist. Like, so many times if you see these horror movies with the ghosts, hauntings and whatnot, it's like the poltergeist is essentially this, like, spirit that has some kind of intense unresolved issue, and it's trying to replay that issue over and over again. So it's like haunting a place, right? And this isn't what we would consider a human being with a soul. It's a qlippoth. It's like a husk or a shell. It has the outer appearance of that person, right? But it's just like a echo or a repeating recording of them, and they're stuck, right? And so they try to interface with humanity to, like, resolve that conflict, but in a way it never, a lot of times, never gets resolved. But there you see what these husks and thought forms are, you know, and we all have this, like, residual self-concept, right? And so as you evolve and as you grow, that self-concept can change, right? And so how you think of yourself now versus 20 years ago could be so different. And how we evolve is to create a futuristic thought concept, to create positive concepts of these more higher capacities that we can develop. And we have a systematic method to build those capacities, and that is the nature of wizarding.